Yeah, what time is it? What time is it?
Morning actually.
Oh, it's
I've
morning.
been
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, that's why the
Yeah.
delay. It's
All right.
difficult to understand.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Joy Malala. As she's probably told you, I'm an assistant professor at University of Warwick, and Catherine Onigia, don't know how you call her, was a colleague of mine when we were doing our PhD together here at the University of Warwick. My research interests are broadly within financial regulation and digital finance. And I look at aspects of fintech regulation, innovation, regulation of innovation, and also consumer credit and debt. And I look at all those things broadly conceived. I also research in the area of financial inclusion as it relates to countries in the global south. And I try to have a critical approach, critical analytical lens through thinking about these issues. So today I'm going to talk about international corporate governance and financial regulation and how it intersects. So what I'm going to be going through is kind of soft and hard law approaches to regulation and what soft and hard law means in the context of corporate governance. And I'm going to be trying to come out of this session. Hopefully, you understand the dynamics between what a variety of ways of regulation mean, and also try to understand the variety of how regulation happens. So the learning outcomes of this session, which won't be 2 hours, I'll probably take maybe an hour or maybe slightly less than an hour. I'm hoping that you'll be able to appreciate the contrast between public interest and special interest explanations of regulation, and we'll try to unpack what those two mean. We'll try to critically compare principle-based and rules-based approaches to regulation, which is perhaps something that you've come across. And then we'll try to see how soft and hard law approaches are usually co-constitutive, or what you would say they complement each other and they are not black and white, so to speak. And then we'll also try to see how or appreciate why corporate governance is essentially a hybrid. So by hybrid, I mean it's a combination of soft and hard law approaches to regulation. Yeah. So I should have sent you the essential reading ahead of this class, but I will give your professor the recommended texts. They are in English, but they are very accessible, so you will get an appreciation of how this topic comes about and what are the texts that are in contradiction and the literature that is in conversation with this topic, the topic of today. And one of them is by Professor Andrew Key. He was my professor when I was in Leeds. He's a professor of company law and corporate governance, and he's the leading scholar in corporate governance and critiquing how corporate governance is perceived within the UK context. So that's the context in which I'm going to be discussing corporate governance and financial regulation. I will mainly look at the UK instruments and a bit of the US instruments, but mainly this is an Anglo, it's called an Anglo-US model. And that's the model in which I guess is seen as the benchmark, but there are still so many critiques of this benchmark. And then we have another text, which is Regulation and Comparative Corporate Governance, which is in the Oxford Handbook of Corporate Governance. And I'll sure to send a list of these texts to your professor who will. I hope you will find interesting. So the other recommended reading is, of course, the book which a lot of scholars in financial regulation look to, and that is the book by Robert Baldwin, Cave and Lodge, which is Understanding Regulations, Theory, Strategy, and Practice, and some other texts which I will share with you. So the reason I give you these texts is because they give you the context through which regulation is perceived within the UK context, what regulation is, what theories, what strategies and practice are employed, because as you know, they are different, particularly in global South countries. And then these are other further reading materials which kind of ground and situate what we're going to be discussing with, and you can use them to enrich your analysis of what corporate governance and financial regulation mean. And so one of them is from the Asian Journal of International Law, Why Does Soft Law Have Any Power Anyway? Yeah, so this is a critique on hard law, and we'll try to unpack what hard law and soft law mean. And then the other one is balancing soft and hard law for business and human rights. Obviously, corporate governance deals with how corporations are run and governed, and they don't just occur in a vacuum. We have to look at other aspects of corporate governance, particularly those aspects that deal with human rights, because corporations do infringe on human rights. They don't exist in a vacuum. And then the other text is in the European Business Organization Law Review. And I will just put the shifting from soft to hard law, and the discussions, a kind of dialectic discussion between people who oppose either soft or hard law in the context of corporate social responsibility. And I'm aware that now we are moving to sustainable governance, right? And so corporate social responsibility is being seen as something that is not contemporary, but we'll try to discuss that as well. So what do we technically mean by the ends and means of regulation? And to try to unpack that, we have to understand or define what regulation means, right? So the Cambridge Dictionary, I should have used the Oxford Dictionary, which is what most people tend to use in the English language, is that it's an official rule or the act of controlling something, right? So we regulate for various reasons, but to define it means that it is a process, right? As well as an action in which the correct procedure is laid down in the rules of something, right? So when it comes to safety, it comes to health, traffic, fire, security, it is how people and organizations are governed, right? So even a state has regulation and they use it to police and control, right? So when we understand what the word means, we try to transpose it into what it is that is being controlled and regulated, right? So in the text that I showed you, it defines regulation as a specific set of commands that bind those who are governed by them, right? So it's a set of rules to be applied, enforced by a body devoted to this purpose, right? And we say that it's a deliberate state intervention. A deliberate state intervention means that the state is the one charged with regulating. Yeah, so we look to the state to regulate. Yeah. So all state actions designed to influence business or social behavior, right? And by social behavior, we can argue policing is part of how the state regulates people's behavior, including things like licensing, where businesses are regulated through licensing, taxes, registries, subsidies. I don't know how it is in Colombia, but if you get news from Africa at the moment, we are going through a very trying time in Kenya. So I'm from Kenya. At the moment, we are in the news because our citizens are in the streets protesting a finance bill that is considered very punitive and considered very draconian because of the taxes it's going to impose on basic life. Right. So it's called the finance bill, and it's at a stage where the president has to assent the bill into law, and the protests in the streets are for the president not to assent those bills. So that's a form of regulation through taxation. Again, all forms of social or economic influence. For instance, the fact that regulation can be either state-based or market-based. And what do we mean by market-based regulation? What you mean is that what economists call the free market thinking, that while the state might have its best intentions in governing and regulating entities, the market also regulates, right? So the market may either dictate the price of goods, in when it comes to either supply and demand dynamics, or if there are other externalities such as whether they are monopoly actors. So they tend to regulate how the market works. And then we also have certain norms, right? And so these norms may be formal or informal. For instance, norms to do with how businesses operate that are not universal. They could be very contextual. They could be contextual in terms of the geopolitics, or contextual in terms of the region, or contextual in terms of the economic region as well, right? So all these influence behavior. All these types of regulation and strategies influence behavior, and more importantly, influence corporate behavior. Yeah. So then we start to think about how regulation does not only constrain or restrict, it can also enable or facilitate. And how it enables and facilitates is a question of the politics of the state, or the politics of the regulator, right? So for instance, when we talk of financial innovation in the area of fintech, right? So the state can choose to either intervene in such matters or not intervene. And by that very fact, that means they have enabled or facilitated something to enter their market, right? So those are strategies and theories in which regulation can be defined. So then we move on to the question of why we regulate. Now, there are many different theories as to why we regulate. There are almost always economic efficiency arguments or social policy arguments, right? So the rationale always proposed for regulating is either down to economic efficiency arguments, such as addressing or correcting market failures. So in the instance of monopolies or natural monopolies, right? The main aims of regulation is to kind of protect consumers, which is almost always the mainstream argument, right? So if you have monopolies in your country, or natural monopolies like utility companies like gas, electricity, or water companies, I don't know if they're all privatized in Colombia, but in Kenya, our electricity company is a utility company, meaning it is the only sole provider. Then it means that regulation there becomes key, right? Because if it is a monopoly, then a failure of that utility means adverse effects, right? So regulation also means that prices may be controlled, because if you're the only provider of something, it means you have you're in a position where you can dictate the prices of goods, right? So there are also reasons why we might want to regulate and that is because of windfall profits. So I'm situated in the UK at the moment, and a lot of the energy companies are privatized, right? And I think about last year, there was a crisis of the price of energy because of different suppliers setting different prices, and the government had a difficult time trying to lower those prices. So they provided subsidies, uh, and what was it? They tried to regulate the cost at which they could give consumers the energy. And this was because the energy companies were coming about with windfall profits that seemed unjust, right? So they would try to transfer the benefits of windfalls from farms to consumers, and consumers obviously are taxpayers, right? So there are also reasons for regulating, such as information asymmetry. So information asymmetry basically means that consumers absolutely have no idea how big companies like pharmaceutical companies operate, right? And for instance, if there's a new drug in the market, a consumer is not able to understand or appreciate either the benefits or the harms that these goods or pharmaceuticals might have on consumers. And so therefore, regulation sets standards through which pharmaceutical companies may operate, right? So it informs consumers and allows a market to operate in a way that tries to balance that information asymmetry, right? Um, then regulation also, which is a kind of both economic and social policy argument, is that it tries to quash anti-competitive and predatory pricing behavior, right? I think we are in the age of big tech, right? And they operate as the most profitable companies. Apple, Google, Meta, and I can't think of the other one, Amazon, as an e-commerce big tech company, right? These companies operate as monopolies, and they engage in anti-competitive behavior. And this can be seen as the way they register their companies in states that allow them not to pay their fair share of tax, and the fact that they can be considered as digital invasive structures and infrastructures. They have embedded themselves into our lives that we cannot function without big tech. I certainly cannot give you this lecture without the help of big tech. Means that they not only participate in anti-competitive behavior, but they also behave in predatory pricing behavior. But regulation almost always tries to quash this negative behavior, which is a credit to regulation, and therefore you'll see that the EU, through its directives, tries to regulate. The US market also tries to regulate their behavior, either through taxation or through data protection laws, and most importantly, to competition policy and laws, right? And then also the fact that regulation perhaps is a way in which it it um, it provides for both social protection and human rights, right? So when you're thinking about how big companies operate in distant places and are engaged in human rights abuses, either through their global value chains or their global supply chains, or the impact they have on the environment. So one way of why we regulate is that we could say we could have deterrent regulation to prevent big companies from I don't know, destroying the environment. So you have oil companies operating in a state, in the Delta state in Nigeria, for instance. And in the 90s, there were human rights cases that came out, and a famous activist, Ken Saro-Wiwa, was executed because of his efforts to bring to light the fact that BP and Shell were destroying the Delta region, right? And they were engaged in human rights abuses because any dissent, any whistleblowing meant that those who were whistleblowing and dissenting were killed, right? And then there are also other reasons why we regulate, because we try to think about how we might think of public goods, right? And we'll speak a little bit about what the public good in relation to what the public interest is, as opposed to what the private interest is, right? So in defense of security services or health services, and these are services provided to the public, then it is incumbent on the state to regulate, right? So that we may, or the public may share the costs where benefits of activity are shared, but the free rider problems may exist, right? And in economics, they call this rents, right? That the state invests in infrastructure, and then you have the so-called innovative companies that come and benefit from those rents. Yeah. And so regulation is important in that dynamic, because if private actors come in and benefit from the rents from the state, it means they do not share the profits from that public investment. And so therefore, that's a rationale for regulating. So I'm wondering if we have any questions up until that point. I'm seeing there are some people in the chat, so I'm wondering if you have questions. And if you do, please, yeah, you can, I don't know if you can raise your hand or some way let me know. And I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah.
Si alguno necesita ayuda puede formular la pregunta en español, yo la traduzco o directamente hacer la pregunta como se sientan más cómodos. O sea, que estoy para apoyar. ¿Hay alguna pregunta? I don't think they have questions until now, Joy.
Okay, no problem. I can continue. That's good. Okay, so there are so many things on my screen. Let me just, put them away. Yeah. So we've kind of looked at reasons why we regulate, and now moving on to evaluating regulation, right? Because if you're going to say that economic efficiency arguments address market failure, and social policy arguments promote social solidarity. And by social solidarity, we mean that it encourages distributional justice, protects rights of weaker parties or vulnerable people, or ensure that there is some kind of vertical or horizontal equity that everyone can share in the profits and the benefits of corporations. Then we must have regulations that intend to do these things, right? And it's not always universal, it's not always uniform, but the intention is what we are trying to address, that states should have that intention to have regulation that encourages social policy arguments. So in doing so, we have to evaluate the regulation. Yeah. So, and how we evaluate it is by looking at what objectives the state might have in regulating. Yeah. So here there's a cartoon that broadly is about having objectives, shows that you can evaluate whether those objectives have been achieved, right? So to decide whether a given regulation or a system of regulation is good, acceptable, or in need of reform, it is necessary to be clear about the relevant benchmarks, right? And these benchmarks is where the contention comes in, right? If you come from the global south like myself, we always benchmark from an Anglo-US perspective, right? All the regulation that comes out of the UK is what is translated, is what is transplanted into the global majority, right? So these are what we always tend to contest and to evaluate whether they are good or fit for purpose, whether they are acceptable or in need of reform if they cease to be working to what the market needs. So it is always necessary to be clear about what objectives are being pursued. Yeah. And so financial regulatory scholars or corporate governance scholars always try to assess what is good regulation against what is bad regulation. Yeah. And so for any domain, they argue that good regulation has to have clear objectives, it has to be targeted, it has to be effective, or rather produces the desired results. It has to be efficient, which is an economic argument. So therefore, it must not be expensive. It has to have the lowest cost and must meet economies of scale, right? And it must rely on expertise, which is a contentious issue. And we'll talk a little bit about what these expertise mean. It must be legitimate. And by legitimate means that it must be grounded in law and allowable by the regulator. It should be fair and transparent, and it must be designed and implemented by accountable agents, right? So all these criteria are what are termed as good regulation, but as you and I know, not all these are always met, right? You could have objectives, they could be targeted, but they could also be unfair and not transparent, right? And in most instances, they may not be accountable, right? You can't hold anyone accountable to how they are designed and implemented, right? They could be efficient, but does not rely on expertise, or the expertise might be questionable. And therefore, this is what they kind of try to universally agree as good regulation. Yeah. So how do you determine what is good regulation? And you do that by measuring and improving regulation. And here I'm putting out the kind of documents that are considered international, but they're basically just UK documents in which they measure how they can improve regulation and grow the UK economy. And I'm sorry, I only have examples from the UK, but it's because of where I'm situated and the students that I teach, right? So they have a few pieces of documents they look through, and these are fairly recent. They come out with policy papers. You can see here one published last year on smarter regulation to grow the economy. There's the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, which comes out with the Regulators Code on how regulation should be carried out. You can see here the OECD produces best practice principles for regulatory policy. So they come out with the impact assessment, they come out with regulatory impact analysis, they come out with practitioners' guide to perception surveys. Sorry. They also come out with guiding principles for regulatory quality and performance. So these are all sort of instruments through which they measure and try to improve regulation. So this is for regulators. So we're going to discuss how the regulation occurs, and I want to put two dichotomies or dynamics to you, and maybe we can discuss them a bit later on the regulatory interests. So we have public interest versus special interest, yeah, as theories of regulation, as two main theories that people prop up for regulation. And we touched on them in a few slides before, but public interest theories of regulation center on the idea that regulators and those seeking greater regulation are selfless and benevolent agents acting in the name of the public interest, right? And that regulation is a means to achieve the greater good. So this is a philosophical argument put forward by Plato's Republic, right? So the idea that those who regulate are these people who are driven by a kind of goodwill to the public, and that is why they do it. But as you and I know, that's not always the case, right? And then we have the other dynamic, which talks about special interest theories, argue that regulation or lack of it is a product of explicit or implicit bargains between self-interested regulators, right? And lobbies, right? Seeking protection from competitors, right? So these special interest theories kind of mirror what we see today in terms of climate change, right? We have the idea that a few years ago, we had a lot of climate deniers, right? And where special interest groups, such as what are they called? Fuel companies would say that actually global warming is junk science, right? Doesn't exist, is not real science, and therefore there's no need to regulate the energy industry. Whereas now we know that not to be true, and therefore we must regulate them, right? We must hold them accountable. Yeah. And so you'd find that private companies would lobby with regulators. And who are the regulators? Perhaps state representatives, right? Senators, governors, people, lawmakers, policymakers in government who have to put out bills and acts that regulate the industry, right? And then you also have special interest groups such as pharmaceutical companies, right? Who would put out products in the market that are not really needed, but because of shareholder primacy, they have to offer returns to their shareholders. Then they must lobby governments to release funds to to make the drugs that they're producing seem much more relevant than they are. And we saw this during the COVID pandemic, where pharmaceutical companies and vaccine manufacturing, we saw that in the inequity in vaccine manufacturing, where they invoked TRIPS agreement, they invoked what is this intellectual property as a way to increase the price of vaccination, right? And this was contrary to public interest theories, where governments, through taxpayer money, were investing the technology, the research in developing these vaccines, yet pharmaceutical companies were able to hijack, right? And say, well, countries that did not develop these drugs need to pay for the drugs. But we all know that vaccinating the population is a public good. So you start to see this kind of push and pull within public interest and special interest regulation, right? And so what special interest theories also argue is the fact that regulation becomes a valuable commodity, right? Because if you're able to hijack and co-opt the regulators, then it becomes valuable what you can do. And what that does is it leads to regulatory capture. So what this means is that the regulators are captured by the very interest they are meant to regulate, right? So for instance, the fact that we said, who are the regulators? What is good regulation is that it relies on expertise, right? So if you are expected to regulate the pharmaceutical industry, you'd expect to get experts in the pharmaceutical industry. And who are these? Scientists, yeah? Or people who work in the biosciences, right? Life sciences, who are expertise in this industry to regulate as they are best suited to do so. They have the expertise to do so. And so what tends to happen is regulatory capture, in that then you find pharmaceutical industries steering regulation in a way that suits their own interests. In the same way that many years ago, the tobacco industry would do that, or car manufacturers would do that, right? Or the airline industry would do that, right? They would try to individualize the problems of the climate by instituting things we call what we know now as a carbon footprint. You know, when airlines try to tell you that if you fly from Colombia to London, this is your carbon footprint. So they try to individualize market problems or global problems to the individual consumer, right? When actually they could be doing more because we actually need to travel. Traveling is a public good, and therefore they cannot individualize what they're doing, right? So do we have any questions up until that point, or contributions?
I'm going to
Yeah.
ask something easy here.
Yeah.
Do you think among all these methodologies that we have to test whether regulation is actually serving public interest, or, as you said, we are in front of a capture of the regulator by specific groups? Among these methodologies, there's one or more than one that would be, let's say, more effective to measure that sort of influence of the private sector and particular interests?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's very difficult to measure how effective regulation can be, and regulatory capture, of course, is a big problem, particularly in the US, for instance, where campaign financing comes from the industry, right? So many of those industries lobby for their own interests, right? And as you are seeing, self-interested regulators who are seeking re-election and are financed in that way, it's kind of hard to measure how good they are. And one way you can put them to test is through what we see as class action lawsuits, right? And class action lawsuits are a good way of measuring the effectiveness of some regulations, to see that, okay, one, are they means tested? And can we actually enforce the law and try to break the monopoly of lobby groups or private interest groups, right? In the UK, campaign financing does not always work in the same way. The lobby groups are not big corporate companies, so to speak, but there is a kind of way in which they do seep into self-interest regulators and policymakers, right? So it is often very difficult to see the effectiveness, right? But we have other pieces of legislation that work in concert. So regulations such as standard regulations, benchmark regulations, professional industry regulators, consumer protection, competition law and policy. So there are all these other ways in which regulatory capture can be tested. Yeah. Yeah. So now, when we look at, we've looked at why we regulate and how we evaluate. Now I'm going to move on to discussing how it fits into corporate governance, and particularly corporate governance in the UK. So in corporate governance in the UK is governed by a particular set of rules, and it's called the Corporate Conduct, the Code of Conduct. And they have a kind of code that seems to suggest that each corporation must adhere to the UK Corporate Governance Code. So the UK Corporate Governance Code is a set of rules that companies should adhere to. And one of the main kind of underlying rationale, or the way they explain it, is that if you don't follow these rules, you must explain why you don't follow them, right? And so that set of rules, or that kind of ethos, or that rationale is called a comply and explain rationale to corporate governance, right? So within this code, in which companies must adhere to, if they don't comply, they must explain why they don't comply, right? So listed companies are to comply with the UK Corporate Governance Code, and companies that do not comply with a given provision must explain why. So, Catherine, I can see you raised your hand.
Yeah, just to share with you that although we are in a very different systems of law,
Yeah,
the approach that the Colombian authorities have followed, especially the what we call the superintendency of companies,
yeah,
is actually a comply or explain. Yeah.
right. So it's similar.
It's exactly the same
Yeah,
approach as
yeah,
we had as let's say
yeah,
benchmark for certain anti-bribery rules.
yes,
The UK,
absolutely.
I
Yeah,
mean, we follow the example and also the approach in
yes.
Colombia.
Yes, absolutely. So already we can see that the benchmark is this UK Corporate Governance Code, which is far-reaching, right? So comply and explain statements are assessed by the market or the company's shareholders, as you may be aware, and so who may view the explanation for non-compliance as insufficient and may decide to do something about it, right? So statements are meant to empower shareholders. They are not reviewed by a regulatory body, which is something that is kind of contentious, right? So it means that they are accountable to shareholders, right? But as you know, corporations do not only operate for the benefit of shareholders, they are in the context of everybody else, right? So that's one point of a critique of this corporate governance code. Yeah. So most companies comply, but it has been critiqued as a box ticking exercise, right? And so this compliance driven box ticking approach means that it's very performative, right? And over here, I don't know if you can see it, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I've put it on the a kind of philosophical, logical question where it asks you, are you a box ticker? And the anecdote is that whether you say yes or no, you're still a box ticker, right? So I don't know if that has been understood, but that's the aim, that whether you say you're a box ticker or you're not, you're still a box ticker, right? So it is easier to always comply rather than explain. And so compliance is always with the letter and not the spirit of provisions, right? In the Global South, we call this creative compliance, right? Meaning that Global South countries that often transplant these corporate codes or these regulations or these standards will never live up to those standards, either because they're not efficient or that they're too expensive to comply with, or the context does not translate. And by translate, I mean the context is very nuanced and very different. And therefore, it leads to creative compliance, where creative compliance is also known as just box ticking, right? So what it leads to, again, is that you have institutional investors often cannot examine in much detail the statements of all companies in their large portfolios, right? So if you're talking about large portfolios, they have to put out statements. I think some of them are yearly statements, a narrative of how their company's corporate governance code has been complied with, right? And these documents are sometimes up to 200 pages, right? And so it leads to a sort of, as I've said, performative action. And also, it leads to reliance on proxy advisors, right? Who also engage in box ticking, right? So if, for instance, there are people within the company who oppose the actions of a CEO, then they are advised on how to build the narrative for their portfolios, right? Yeah. And the UK Corporate Governance Code 2016, for instance, required listed companies to set out how they had applied 18 main principles. So you have to explain how. And some of them include, I think, as Kathleen has mentioned, issues on financial crime or bribery or anti-bribery laws. And if you fail to comply with them, you have to explain why. And so some of them considered 27 supporting principles, and they had to explain these deviations. They also required companies to engage in detailed disclosure, which becomes a compliance exercise. And then for instance, in 2017, the average length of an annual report of a FTSE 350 company was 170 pages, which seems onerous. And so therefore only the top companies can do this. And so in 2018, they called for a simplifying the code in explicit effort to address box ticking, right? And so there were also critics of this code saying that should the code be abolished? And here I'm going to share with you a paper that this professor from Cambridge, and it was written last year, and he often writes about critiquing the corporate governance code because this code is fairly new. It's only 30 years. It's about, well, less than 40 years. So he was calling to abolish the UK corporate governance code because he argues in his paper it is not fit for purpose, right? And through this paper, he showed that there's empirical evidence that better corporate governance leads to improved corporate performance, and compliance with the code leads to improved corporate governance is tenuous at best, right? And he also argues that the code imposes growing costs, right? Costs associated with experts used in drafting their comply and explain statements, and costs associated with the adoption of these corporate governance arrangements. So you can already see the sort of constraints and challenges of implementing regulation in the market, right? And then also, he argues that the code was designed in an era when the mantra was the minimization of agency costs. And the solution was shareholder empowerment, right? So it was poorly suited to a world where stakeholder engagement matters, right? And by the difference between shareholder and stakeholder is that stakeholders are those who are impacted by the actions of the company, right? And shareholders are impacted, but only materially, right? Because they have a share in the company. So it is not addressing contemporary issues, but historical ones. Yeah. And so abolishing the code, he argues, and only keeping the 18 principles, which are foundational to corporate governance, will encourage experimentation within corporate governance. Yeah. And so then we start to see how you can distinguish between a principle-based approach to corporate governance and a rules-based approach to corporate governance, or even consequently regulation looks like. So in the UK, their type of regulation is termed as a principle-based, aka it is code-based. And I'm sure Kathleen will speak a lot, has spoken a lot about principle-based and rules-based approach, right? So in corporate governance, the UK has a rules-based approach meaning it is regulator-led, right? And so here I have some examples of a regulator-led approach. One is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. It was enacted following the Enron scandal, accounting scandal. If many of you are familiar with it, it was a company that had audit and accounting scandals that gave the Securities and Exchange Commission the responsibility for implementing and enforcing good corporate governance, and so a much higher cost of non-compliance, right? As you've seen in a lot of all these investment scandals, including those in the capital markets, the Securities and Exchange Commission is the main regulator and always imposes fines, or the cost for non-compliance there is high. Yes, I can see you raised your hand.
I'm here, yeah. There is a question on the PSN, and let me see. Basically, the idea is in Colombia, based on the
Yeah,
principle of solidarity,
yeah,
financial debtors have been
yeah,
protected when they face extreme calamities. I mean, let's say,
yeah. Crisis, yeah,
yeah, financial distress, special
yeah,
financial distress,
yeah,
as it was in COVID, for instance.
yeah,
Contractual terms,
yeah,
and clauses are adjusted for them through jurisprudential, let's say, judges deciding cases, I mean, on an
yeah,
individual case basis.
yeah.
And is there a legal or some sort of norm, or we may say a common law based term regarding this in the UK?
Common law. I think the term they use in private law here is a kind of force majeure, right?
Yeah,
Where
that will be also applicable in the case of Colombia, but that wasn't during COVID-19, wasn't the main or the only cause of action.
yeah,
The
so
concept of force
mhm.
majeure.
Yeah, so in the UK there were a lot of not just private contracts that invoked force majeure, and as we know, force majeure is when contracts might be frustrated, and in COVID that proved to be very, very important, because it meant that parties to a contract could decide to change the terms of the contract to suit the situations, right? And the state was also kind of implicitly, and in some cases explicitly, intervening in certain regulations, right? And that's why we were able to see that they could put in what is this called? Special provisions, special regulations for companies, either to furlough their employees. So they gave grants to companies, even private companies, to continue paying their workers, even though those companies had no income at the time. So I think those were some mechanisms put in place. Yeah.
And do you have in mind something like a special provision that was of mandatory compliance? Because what we have in Colombia was the general set of instructions for the financial supervisor, telling banks to
Mhm.
reassess the
Yeah.
terms of particular types of credits, of loans.
Yes.
Let's say
Yes.
those related to consumers in special vulnerability situations, and
Yeah.
those with mortgages as well. But
Yes.
were
Absolutely.
instructions, and actually financial institutions had the freedom whether to adopt and how to adopt those measures.
Yes, there were some moratoriums on some debt obligations, and the moratorium was that they gave some what is it called? They call it breathing space, to prevent, particularly in consumer credit agreements, from financial institutions from enforcing or requiring consumers to pay back, right? So there were some moratoriums put in place. There were also some tax breaks. So if you were purchasing a house within that period, they kind of excluded stamp duty, so you didn't have to pay stamp duty. So there were, I think that was in efforts to encourage purchasing at the time because the housing market was about to collapse, right? So they did that to encourage people to still purchase homes, get into mortgage agreements. So there were all these sorts of measures at the time that were seen to show that the government can intervene. Yeah, well, they had to intervene, I would say. Yeah. So just to continue, that the enforcement of corporate governance principles has to, of course, be enshrined in law. And there was a review that showed that the government's response maintains faith in existing code-based approach, which means that the government is not looking to go through a rules-based approach to corporate governance. They still have faith in the principle-based approach. And so questions were about whether this is a kind of a good decision. And so what you start to see is that there's essentially a hybrid corporate governance regulation, right? And what does this hybridity mean? It means that companies are neither purely private, creatures of contract, nor purely public, creatures of the state. They are essentially a hybrid organization. Even if we can say that big tech is a private company, if it is publicly listed, then it becomes a hybrid entity, right? And the governance of companies is neither purely private, self-regulation through internal structures, nor purely public, regulatory led. It is both at the same time. And so all these have to come together in an essentially hybridity, right? So it is always hybrid or quasi-contractual and including regulatory rules. And so in the UK, principle-based is considered soft law, right? But important role of the Companies Act, which is the hard law, comes into place, right? And in the US, their rules-based mechanism is considered hard law because it is regulator-led, state-led. But its important role of best practice principle is considered the soft law aspects, right? So all these kind of two ways operate in tandem. Yeah. And so that's my presentation on the UK corporate governance. And I'm keen to discuss with you in this like maybe 10, 15 minutes. If you have any questions, we can discuss whether in Colombia it is purely principle based or hard law also exists, or whether it is hybrid and how efficient it is, and what kind of political economy aspects layer into this dynamic. Yeah. Oh,
Mario?
yes.
Um, yes, hi, good morning. I don't
Good
know.
morning. Yeah, good morning.
Um, yeah, it's just that I have a question, especially based on the something that you say, Mrs. Joy, that
Yeah.
I think is important because it's something that is happening like right now. And
Yeah.
is that you said that companies um cannot like individualize the problem in the
Mm,
consumers or tend to,
yeah.
like to, so because my question is, because we have now like here, especially here in Bogota, problem with the water supply in the major cities, and what the state is trying to do is to, I think, individualize the problem, because what they are doing is like cutting in days the water to the houses or to the
Yeah.
apartments, to the people. So I
Yeah.
think in that way they are individualizing the problem,
Yeah.
taking into account that the major companies that are the ones that are really, in a way, spending most
Yeah.
of the water, should be one of the main objects of this regulation, taking
Yeah.
into account that
Yeah.
they are the well they are the ones that are using most of the water.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't know what is your opinion in that, taking into account also that the companies have to use the water, to
Yeah.
all the processes of manufacturing and all those
Yeah.
things. So I
Yeah.
don't know how can, like, what is your opinion, taking into account that they cannot individualize that problem in the consumers,
Yeah.
because where really consumers are that has the less consumption of water,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
companies are, on the contrary, are having the most consumed, but they also need be, again,
Yeah.
to do all the process of industrial manufacturing. So I don't
Yeah.
know how the problem could be solved, taking into account the public and the private,
Yeah. I mean, this is a very classic example of business and human rights questions, right? Because corporations, we can't avoid them. They, many of them, particularly if they are privatized. So if water companies are privatized, they provide a public good. So you have private entities providing a public good. So the ways in which regulation tries to remedy this is either through taxation and creative ways of taxation, right? So they try to distribute the profits of the company to its consumers, or they are they impose particular taxes on these companies to deter them, right? So you'd have a tax on the way they what is it called, they have loss and damage funds, for instance, right? So companies that for instance, I'll give you an example of the Congo, right? The Congo is a rich source of a lot of materials that global companies use, for instance, Apple for iPhones, right? But it has led to a lot of loss of life and damage to the environment there. But if Apple was to provide them with a particular fund that says, okay, we are going to pay taxes to the Congolese people, we know, of course, that will not happen. It is not happening, right? And say this fund is to kind of repair and there's a lot of literature on reparations in climate action, right? You've degraded an area, the people have suffered, but the company has to pay them back. So these are arguments that are put forth by environmentalists, by climate activists, by scholars who are of that orientation, that argue for these kinds of reparation. So I would say that the only way that these water companies ration water that is essential for life is through government taxation. Yeah, that is the only way now. I mean, there are other ways, by deterring or even nationalizing water companies because they're providing a public good. But that is the way now that I can only argue for these companies. And then, of course, in a perfect society, taxation leads to distributional justice or equitable distribution of the profits of these private companies. But that's not always the case. But that is one argument. Yeah, I would say.
Thank you very much, Mr. J.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question?
Okay, I'm going to ask something. Do you think that there would be there could be a good idea to design different standards of corporate governance for large enterprises and small and medium enterprises? Because in Colombia, if we see the composition of the market around what has been reported at least, around 95% of companies are small and medium enterprises,
Yeah,
which means
yeah.
that the regulation that we have, some sort of code of conduct,
Yeah.
that is applicable to listed companies.
Yeah.
That let's say benchmark is not designed for purpose
Yeah.
for small
Yeah.
and medium enterprises, and there are no regulatory the provisions seeking to at least promote within the SMEs the adoption of corporate standards. We have something by the time of COVID when SMEs were authorized to enter into the secondary market to negotiate bonds. And that provision is no longer functioning now. I mean, it might happen in the near future, but we never know now with the current government. We never know nothing. But besides that, the idea is whether to not only for listed companies or whether if SMEs are going to participate or not in the exchange market, but if it would be better idea to provide some sort of principles based, that that I'm a defender of principles based regulation. And trying to propose some sort of principle that could be applicable, nor costly regulation and by SMEs.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right, because even in the UK, one of the main critiques is that the corporate governance code is very expensive to implement, and it imposes a heavy burden on SMEs, right? Because if you're to comply to the 18 principles, it means that you must have either the legal capacity, the expertise within, or the portfolio to explain, right? And there's one code which deals with bribery, and I think some aspects of financial crime. And these are principles that are not fit for SMEs particularly, but for FTSE 500 or 350 companies, those major publicly listed companies, right? So there should be some form of proportionality. And if you're to introduce a tier for SMEs or middle enterprises, it's also another form of regulation to implement, right? So I think an argument would be to simplify the codes, right? And provide for flexible implementation or flexible compliance. Well, not flexible, because companies will do whatever they want, but a lower threshold depending on the size of the company, right? So, or depending on the portfolios or their impact, because that's really, really important, right? You wouldn't expect a small company, a small SME company, less than maybe 500 employees with a smaller portfolio to bear the impact of what, I don't know, a major energy company drilling oil wells abroad, right? So I think there should be some proportionality, and that's, I agree, one of the critiques of these principle-based approaches. Yes, Mario.
Yes, I'm sorry. It's just that I when we started, or well, in the whole presentation, you talk about regulation.
Yeah.
But for us in Colombia, it's a little bit difficult to think about regulation without thinking in our constitutional court, because the courts, can they have like a function, especially in Colombia, as a negative regulator that it is not the one that produce like the law, but the one that can, like extract the law
Yeah, right.
from the system, from the
Yeah,
regulatory system. So
yeah.
in that way, I would like to know like what's the role in the UK of the courts when they, you know, when when I don't know if
Yeah,
courts have
yeah,
like a function
yeah.
like so powerful like in our system,
Mm, yeah,
because for example there was a law uh like recent law that was being studied where a tax to the benefits of the petroleum companies, if I'm not wrong,
right. Yeah,
were being taxed,
right.
and when the court studied that specific tax, they said that
Mm-hmm.
it was unconstitutional
Yeah,
because of the, sometimes the court uh, like they study and they think that the tax is being like to companies is being a little bit um problematic for could be
right.
problematic for the company. So
Yeah,
like in the UK, I don't know if you have like that kind of you know of
yeah.
powerful court, but yeah,
Yes,
my question is that like
yeah.
where is
Who who reg
the role,
yeah,
yeah, the role that
absolutely. Who regulates the regulators? That's
exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
that's a question that we always ask. So in the UK, they don't have a written constitution, they would say, right? So it's always very difficult to raise concerns on a constitutional basis, right? I come from Kenya, we do have one. So we are always quick to invoke the constitution and sovereign rights when we see that there kind of these cases that arise. But in the UK, what they do have is a unwritten constitution where they have certain instruments that are able to assert certain rights or certain claims, right? So they have the EU is one such. Well, they left the EU, so that doesn't apply, but they do have the European Court of Human Rights, which they are also trying to leave. But they also have the Human Rights Act of 1998. They have their own sets sort of legislate, like the Companies Act. So they have various sorts of legislations which act in concert, right? And also as a common law country, we are guided by precedent set, right? So there are certain key cases through which judges use to set precedent, right? And contravening those cases means that it would have to go through a judicial review, right? It almost never happens. And if it does, it is monumental. But there are various ways and means through which claims can be still made on constitutional grounds. Yeah. So if, for instance, you say the most recent case I can think of, the judgment just came out a few months ago, and it is the first case in the UK where a council was found guilty of an environmental crime, right? So it's the case of a young girl who died. She was suffering from asthma, and the company, this company that was operating where she lives, and the case brought forward was arguing that the emissions that they were releasing led to her death, and that case went up to the Supreme Court of the UK, and it won. So these kinds of cases are what set precedents, yeah, and can be seen as a kind of uh, uh, constitutional tool, so to speak, right? So through this, then companies now can, corporations, large corporations that emit fumes might kind of reorient themselves and how they operate. And it also sends a signal to um to this to citizens that actually you can bring such a claim forward. So I think that's the only way when you lack a written constitution. Yeah,
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah, yeah. Very well. Any final questions? Comments even?
I was telling them at the beginning that your slides will be available for them to check, especially the recommended readings.
Yes,
And so
absolutely.
they have this chance to look a bit further in each of the topics.
Oh yes, I should have
Um,
put my email address there, so I'll put it on the chat.
yeah, please do, in case they have more questions
Yes,
about the
absolutely.
UK
Yes.
dynamics.
Yeah. So I broadly research on many things on banking regulation and so if you're interested in those things, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions or even just discuss things. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
unless there's somebody with questions or comments, I think we could just
Oh, we have
Sally,
someone.
hey,
Yeah.
Sally,
Hi,
yeah.
how are you? Good
Yeah.
morning and good afternoon in
Yeah.
Finland.
Yeah. Yeah. Hello, Sally. Yes.
Um, what do you think about, or what impact have them protest in, for example, in London about regularly, when some of that regulation are not unfair or are not transparent, and what what
Yeah.
what what is the impact? Maybe if that can help to, I don't know, to solve the hard that kind of regulation there. Or for
Yeah.
example, here in Colombia, we could we have an impact in because of the protesting of about the how to save or how to protect or care about water here in
Yeah.
some special place that we have to care, or we have to um um how do you say that it well so some kind of people that try to investor that
Yeah.
so they sorry for my English for not
No,
that
absolutely. No. I
practice,
understand. I understand you. Yeah.
but I would like to know how can the protest impact in some that kind of regulation.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I think protest is important, but it depends but it's important to understand that, of course, protest is a process and there are so many strategies that are employed, right? And one fundamental thing that we have to understand is that the state has to have political will, right? Once the state doesn't have political will, then everything else is undermined, right? Um, I gave the example of what is happening in Kenya right now. Yesterday we had very deadly protests of a finance bill that is going to be put forward that is going to tax us to death because we need to pay loans to the IMF and the World Bank, right? So the best way to do it is, according to the IMF, is to overtax us. So Kenyans were protesting yesterday, they're protesting today and tomorrow, and it has led to a lot of bloodshed, right? But if the state is unwilling to listen to protesters and its people, then it's dead on arrival, right? And this is often a very difficult thing to balance, especially when you're calling for fairness and transparency, right? And particularly if you're dealing with, as we talked about, special interests, right? So in Kenya's situation, we could argue that there are special interests. The IMF has a special interest. It wants its loans to be repaid, right? The member of parliaments have special interests because they want to be re-elected, right? If you go against the electorate, then you will not be re-elected. And I guess in Colombia, investors of these private companies have special interests, right? So it is a very difficult question. I don't have the answer, but then the protest, as I've said, protest is a process. It is not an event. It has to be an ongoing strategy to undermine what is not of the public interest, right? So the strategies that Kenya, for instance, is doing is that the strategies are that They will not platform politicians because of the context in which we operate. Politicians are our superstars. They will refuse to give audience to the president. They will picket. They will do all these things to kind of sabotage the finance bill from going through. Yeah. So yeah, it's a very difficult. In the UK, they don't often protest on these types of issues, but what I have seen is the strategies they employ is through taking class action lawsuits, right? To kind of defer and delay tactics of actions, various actions. That's what I've seen it. That's how I've seen it happen here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's also another question here in the Q&A. Jody
Oh.
says, you talk about the purpose of and theories of regulation. Even though regulation is necessary to address some problems, what do you think about over-regulation, specifically in contexts such as Colombia, where over-regulation can stop economic growth?
Well, I think, Catherine, you can answer that. You have
What do you think? I think
you know Colombia's context. I mean, I know Kenya's context where
yeah.
So as I keep saying, Kenya is a post-colony, right? It was a colony of a British colonial state, and a lot of the regulations we have are basically transplanted from the UK. And I think regulation can be a tool that also oppresses, I've seen, particularly over-regulation, right? So it seems to protect consumers and market efficiency and all these economic theories of regulation, but over-regulation at the same time, it stifles a lot of industries, particularly regulation in the form of taxation. So I don't know what over-regulation in the Colombian context looks like. Maybe Kathleen can explain.
Okay, to give you some idea. No, the fact is that in Colombia we have a tendency to understand that in order to solve any market issue, any consumer related issue, we have to create a new law or a secondary, let's say, type of law that is the decree that comes from the government in special purposes or for special purposes. That makes compliance kind of costly. And actually, investors usually complain when they want to enter the Colombian market about the complexity of regulation and the amount of regulation that they to observe. One reason might be not only political reasons that are already there, but also the fact that this idea of adopting a strategy of regulation is not something that we have been concerned for a long time. Only maybe from the government that passed the government around 2015 more or less onwards, the national government will start to adopt some of these OECD principles on how to assess a regulation, the regulatory impact assessment, and is something that, for example, for public utilities regulation is already being implemented just to review whether we have a lot of regulation or not enough regulation, basically to do somehow a diagnostic by sector. If you go into the financial services, is the supervisor not the regulator? The one that tries to construct on the basis of the risk-based approach. That is not, it's somehow not well articulated. Therefore, what we have is an explosion of laws, which it makes difficult the compliance thing. I think it's something that we could share with some other Latin American countries. Again, not Mexico, no Brazil, that's different. They are in the same region, but we are not similar to each other. But the Caribbean and other countries within South America may face similar challenges around the amount of regulation in place and how it prevents, as Cristina said, the economic growth and is a discouragement for investment as well.
Yeah. Any other questions? I think there's some comments. Yeah, I don't think there are.
No.
No,
So,
no more questions.
I think
Yeah.
we can wrap up here. Joe,
Yeah,
thank you.
yes.
Thank you so much
No
for joining us
problem.
today, for
Yeah,
sharing with us all your knowledge and experience about these interesting topics. So we look forward to inviting you for the next event in next year or later this year. I don't know.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
very happy to
Is it
have
going
you
to
at
be in
least
person? Is it?
virtually in Colombia. I mean,
Yes,
while you
absolutely.
actually go to Colombia, you have to go.
Yes,
And I
I
have
have
to
to.
invite you as well.
Yes, you have to. Absolutely.
I will.
Yeah, it was very nice to see and talk to you, and I hope I'll be hearing from you soon. And all the best. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye, everyone.
Bye.